Hello all, I hope that you're having a good week, and we're going to look at our third lecture this week, and that's about historiography and primary and secondary sources. We're going to talk about what primary sources are, what are secondary sources, and that they're often not what you think they are, what your personal opinions have to do with history. And this is just a lecture that we're going to talk about how history is written. History is not always black and white, there's lots of gray. I think people often picture history as this kind of timeline of events, but the reality is there's a lot more area for interpretation than we often see. History is not a single truth. Just because something's published in a book does not automatically make it the true version. There are multiple versions for every historical event. We can consider some of the current issues and how people will write about them in the future, like the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, Ukraine nationalists versus Russian rebels, MSNBC or Fox News. Which one you listen to could have a huge influence on how you feel about a lot of things. What will historians of the future have to say if they only rely on one set of voices about the Affordable Care Act, for example? Or what if they look at the Ukraine local news versus Putin's Russian-controlled media? How might that change the way they view these historical events? Or we can go back even further. We can talk about Kennedy's assassination. Some people believe it was a single gunman. Some people believe it was a conspiracy with other people. Vietnam is probably one of the most debated historical events on political, economic, military, and social perspectives. History is not always seen, history is always seen through the lens of the original observer, and then it's filtered through later perspectives. So, as I said, if you're looking at different sources, they all have a perspective, and then historians pick up those sources and they have their own perspective. Another example is the Civil War. It's called the U.S. Civil War. It's also called the War of Northern Aggression. Those terms reflect very different perspectives. So who's writing the earliest version of this history? Is it the Northern Yankees, the Southern rebels, Democrats or Republicans, slave owners or abolitionists? These perspectives all change how they'll see the history that's happening. Later 19th century and early 20th century versions, political, economic, military theories, and contemporary conditions can all influence the way that history is seen. Late 20th century versions of the history of the Civil War are very different than these early histories written. They're social histories, and they include a perspective from African Americans and women that was very new to the 20th century because of the social movements that came about in the late 50s, early 60s, and then continued into the 70s. 20th century may bring about all new interpretations of these historical events. Economic and political developments are changing the way we see things all the time. So historiography is a study of historical perspectives, not historical events. More important is the way different historians have looked at it than necessarily the event itself. So it's a study of how history is written. There are historiography classes that study the schools of thought or perspective for history majors. Which sources are selected, how are those sources interpreted, so different schools of thought, and how are those sources synthesized or put together. And so there are whole classes that are just on the idea of historiography and how these ideas almost conflict with each other, how these different schools of thoughts have seen events, and how different those are. And I touched on that a little bit in the first lecture this week, when I talked about different historiographies and how they viewed the indoor relief that we looked at. What does different historiography mean to us in this class? So we'll not take the time to study all the various schools of thought in social welfare in America. There's a lot of schools of thought in American history. But it's important for you to realize that there are multiple perspectives. And you're going to run into them when you're viewing your sources for your research paper. And you need to think about how you're going to synthesize that into your argument. Because of the limited time, we've tried to avoid strongly biased perspectives, but you may encounter them. And they may be one way or the other. And you'll very likely encounter different perspectives, and you'll have to figure out how to incorporate that into your research paper. Embrace different perspectives. Don't avoid them. Don't avoid a source just because maybe it doesn't fit in with the idea you already have of your topic, because that can bring fresh new ideas. Some important things to think about: what's the date of publication? Even though events have occurred a long time ago, recent interpretations are important. So historians study historical events, but we want you to look at more recent interpretations, because history changes as we go. And what do you learn from a different perspective? What might open your mind if you look at someone who sees your event differently, which is more persuasively argued? Look at the sources the author used. Look at the date of their sources. Look at how academic they are. You know, we will look at sources next, but you know, sources need to be academic. They need to not be wiki sources. They need to be well thought out, well researched sources. So who has better source material? You know, every week I include a reference slide, so I can tell you where my sources come from. Be sure you guys watch the little video I have about historiography. It's really fun, and it's also very educational. It's going to give you a lot of information. So now I'm going to talk about primary and secondary sources. The distinction is not what you use the most or least of. For example, primary is not the most, and secondary is not the least. Primary sources are original documents or artifacts that have not been evaluated. And that word is really important, that they have not been evaluated. They're letters, diaries, journals, legal documents like wills or court transcripts, government documents, speeches, or interviews. Secondary sources are publications that summarize or interpret primary sources, books, articles, or dissertations. Both primary and secondary sources are important to how we write history. Primary is the voice and the account of the time, original records without anyone else telling you what the documents mean. So primary sources require a little more interpretation. You know, as a historian, that's what you guys are going to be doing as you do your research paper. You are going to be historians, researching primary sources and interpreting them and figuring out what they mean in the scheme of your event. Secondary sources include an interpretation and analysis, and they should be in light of extensive research and sometimes multiple disciplines. Secondary sources can be problematic. Be sure you use current secondary sources, as I said earlier. Historiography changes over the time, so the way we've looked at history changes as we get further away from events. Look at the footnotes in the article you read for this course and observe how the authors move back and forth between primary and secondary sources. Look at how these footnotes incorporate these sources and how they take primary sources and talk about analysis with them, and look at how they talk about perspective in secondary sources. You're going to use both primary and secondary sources in your research paper. If you're still struggling with what that means, please, please, please be sure to talk to me. We are going to, later in the class, have the librarian come in, and she's going to talk to us in 2 separate webinars, one during the day and one in the evening, about how to use the library. She's an amazing resource, and you can chat with and email her, and you can call her, and she's going to be there for you, and she's going to help work through these. Also, feel free to ask me. You know, we used to have to go, when I first did history, you had to go and you had to find primary sources and you held them in your hands. We have an amazing ability with the internet now to access things right from your living room that you could never have accessed before. Pictures and letters and diaries and things that are all originals that are now scanned into the computer, and you can just look at them online. One great place that I'm recommending is the Social Welfare History Project. I'm sure you can already tell we're going to be doing a lot of reading and working with that. They have primary sources and they're online. Another great one that I love as a general history is the Library of Congress. Be sure you find a primary source and offer your own perspective. That's what I want to hear from you guys, is what you think about some of this and some of your own analysis.